Chapter 1. The Call. May 4th, 1945, 1400 hours. 3rd Army Forward Headquarters, Linz, Austria. The phone rings in a stone building that once housed Austrian bureaucrats. Now it houses American command. The walls are thick, pre-war construction, the kind that muffles artillery but not anger. General George Smith Patton Jr. stands by the window, 59 years old, 2 ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. Not pearl, never pearl. Ivory. He's corrected that mistake 1,000 times. The distinction matters to him in ways that would take a psychiatrist years to unpack. Outside, 3rd Army engineers are stringing communication wire. Jeeps move through streets where Austrian civilians watch with expressions Patton has learned to read. Not quite gratitude, not quite fear, something in between. The look of people who've survived one occupation and aren't sure about the next. The phone keeps ringing. Patton's aide, a captain whose name history won't remember, reaches for it. Patton waves him off. He knows who's calling. He's been expecting this call for 2 days, dreading it, anticipating it, the way a boxer anticipates the bell. He picks up the receiver. Patton. The voice on the other end is familiar. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force. The man who controls the entire European theatre. The man Patton has known since they were young officers together, back when the world was different and war meant something else entirely. But this isn't the voice Patton knows from staff meetings. This isn't the diplomat. This isn't the politician in an army uniform. This is something else. George. One word. Eisenhower's voice is cold in a way Patton has heard maybe 3 times in 30 years. What the hell are you doing in Linz? Patton looks out the window. At his 3rd Army. At American flags flying over a city 80 miles past where he was ordered to stop. 80 miles into what the diplomats in Yalta decided belonged to someone else. Ike, the bridges were intact. Germans were retreating east. Somebody had to secure the area. The Soviets were supposed to secure that area. Eisenhower's voice rises half an octave, not quite shouting, not yet. We have signed agreements. Stalin is already sending messages through Marshall about American units in the Soviet occupation zone. You were ordered to hold at the Enns River. The Enns, George, not Linz. Patton watches a German woman push a cart past American sentries. The sentries nod at her. She nods back. Small civilities in the ruins of the Third Reich. Well, Ike, Patton says, and there's that tone in his voice, the one that's gotten him in trouble before, will get him in trouble again. I figured possession is 9/10 of the law. We're here. We took it without firing a shot. The local population is actually relieved to see us instead of the Red Army. Silence on the line. Not the silence of consideration. The silence of a man choosing his next words very carefully. This isn't about tactics, George. This is diplomacy. We're trying to build a post-war alliance with the Soviets. You've just driven a tank column straight through that alliance. Patton's jaw tightens. He's heard this speech before. Different words, same meaning. Don't upset the Russians. Don't complicate the politics. Don't think about what comes after Germany surrenders. But Patton has been thinking about what comes after, has been thinking about it since Sicily, since he watched Soviet officers and saw something in their eyes that other people missed, or chose not to see. With respect, sir, and there's very little respect in how he says it, if we're building an alliance, we should negotiate from a position of strength. Right now, we're in Linz. They're not. That's strength. George, Eisenhower's voice drops, lower, harder. I need you to understand something. President Roosevelt is dead 3 weeks. Truman is trying to establish credibility. The entire post-war order is being negotiated right now. Right now, George, while you're standing in a city you weren't authorized to occupy, and you've just made my job as Supreme Commander infinitely harder. Patton hears it. The genuine frustration, the genuine fear. Eisenhower isn't playing politics. He's trying to hold together an alliance that's already starting to crack. But Patton also hears what Eisenhower isn't saying. That maybe, just maybe, having American forces in Linz changes the negotiation. I need you to hold your current position, Eisenhower continues. and prepare to withdraw if ordered. The words land like artillery shells. Withdraw. Patton's hand tightens on the receiver. Withdraw! Ike, these are American positions now. My men took this ground. They bled to get here. Your men weren't authorized to be there in the first place. Long silence. In the background, Patton can hear voices, officers talking, radio chatter, the machinery of SHAEF headquarters in Reims trying to manage a war that's almost over and a peace that's just beginning. Understood, sir. Patton's voice is flat, controlled. Third Army will hold current positions. George, I'm serious about this. Do not click. Patton hangs up the phone, sets the receiver down gently. Not a slam, not defiance, just done talking. His aide stares at him. The captain's face has gone pale. You don't hang up on the Supreme Commander. You don't hang up on Eisenhower. Not if you want to keep your stars. Maybe not if you want to avoid a court-martial. Patton turns back to the window. His Third Army. His command. The men who followed him from North Africa through Sicily, through France, through the Bulge, through Germany. All the way to this Austrian city that nobody in Washington wants them to hold. Get me General Kilburn, Patton says quietly. Tell him I need a status report on all forward positions and find out exactly where the Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army is. I want to know how close they are and what they're doing. The aide salutes, leaves. The room is quiet except for the sound of Linz outside the window. A city breathing, existing in that strange space between war and whatever comes next. Patton doesn't move, doesn't sit, just stands there, looking out at 80 miles of unauthorized occupation. He knows what's coming, knows Eisenhower will call again, knows Washington will demand explanations, knows Moscow is probably screaming bloody murder to anyone who'll listen. But he also knows something else. Something he's learned in 3 years of war that the diplomats in their conferences haven't figured out yet. The Soviets respect strength, only strength. And right now, Third Army is strong. In Linz, holding ground that changes the map. The question is how long he can hold it before someone forces him to give it back. 300 miles west, in Reims, France, General Dwight David Eisenhower sits at his desk and stares at a dead telephone. He's 55 years old. Looks older. The war has aged everyone. But Eisenhower carries a particular kind of weight, not just military, political, diplomatic. The weight of holding together Americans, British, French and Soviets in an alliance that was always more fragile than the newspapers reported. His chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, stands in the doorway, 49 years old, sharp features, sharper mind, the kind of officer who sees 3 moves ahead and doesn't like what he's seeing. How did it go, sir? Smith asks. Eisenhower slowly sets down the receiver. He hung up on me. Smith's expression doesn't change, but something flickers in his eyes. Surprise, concern, maybe a little bit of respect for the sheer audacity. General Patton hung up on the Supreme Commander, Smith says carefully, while occupying a city 80 miles into the Soviet occupation zone, without authorization. That's an accurate summary, yes. Smith walks to the map on the wall. Europe, color-coded, blue for Allied positions, red for Soviet. The Enns River in Austria, a neat blue line marking where American forces were supposed to stop. And then, 80 miles east, a small notation in fresh ink. Third Army elements, Linz. The Soviets know? Smith asks. Marshal Tolbukin sent a communication an hour ago, demanding clarification of American positions and intentions. Very polite, very diplomatic, but the subtext is clear. What the hell are we doing in their occupation zone? Smith studies the map, and Patton's current disposition. Eisenhower pulls out a field report, reads from it. Elements of the 11th Armored Division in and around Linz. 65th Infantry Division moving forward. Estimates put American strength in the Linz sector at approximately 23,000 troops. And Soviet strength? Red Army's 6th Guards Tank Army is 18 miles east of Linz. Marshal Konev is moving elements of the 4th Ukrainian Front south. Intelligence estimates 80,000 Soviet troops within 24 hours of the city. The numbers hang in the air. 23,000 Americans, 80,000 Soviets, in peacetime Austria, with no clear orders about who backs down. Smith turns from the map. What's Patton doing? Right now, I mean, his intentions. Eisenhower picks up another report, this one from 3rd Army headquarters. According to this, General Patton has ordered defensive fortifications constructed around key positions in Linz. He's also moved additional units to secure roads leading to Salzburg. Defensive fortifications, Smith repeats. He's not preparing to withdraw, he's preparing to stay. That appears to be the case. Smith walks back to Eisenhower's desk, sits down in the chair across from the Supreme Commander. They've worked together long enough that formality sometimes gives way to frank conversation. Ike, Smith says quietly, this could get very bad very fast. Eisenhower nods, he knows, has known since the moment he read the first report about Patton crossing the Ends. This isn't just an unauthorized advance. This isn't just a tactical adjustment. This is American forces occupying Soviet-designated territory, while Stalin watches to see if the new American president will enforce the agreements the old one signed. Get me a direct line to General Marshall in Washington, Eisenhower says, and find out everything you can about Soviet positions in that sector. If their forward elements run into Patton's armor, this could turn into something neither Washington nor Moscow wants. Smith nods, stands, pauses at the door. Sir, if I may, what are you going to do about Patton? Eisenhower looks at the map, at Linz, at the 80 miles between where Patton should be and where he is. I'm going to Austria, Eisenhower says. I'm going to deliver the order to withdraw personally. And if he refuses? Eisenhower doesn't answer immediately, because he knows Patton, knows the man's brilliance, knows his flaws, knows that Patton sees the Soviet Union as a threat in ways that official policy doesn't acknowledge yet. Then I'll have a problem, Eisenhower says finally, a very big problem. Chapter 2. The Believer. To understand what happens in Linz, you have to understand Patton. Not the caricature, not the headlines, the man. George Smith Patton Jr. was born November 11th, 1885. California. Wealthy family. Military tradition going back generations. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father graduated West Point. Patton absorbed all of it. The history, the tradition, the belief that some men are born to lead in war. He graduated West Point in 1909. Cavalry. Back when cavalry meant horses, not tanks. He competed in the 1912 Olympics, modern pentathlon, finished 5th. The shooting cost him a medal. He claimed the judges misjudged his shots. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. The story tells you something about Patton. He believed in his own excellence even when the scoreboard disagreed. World War I changed him. Changed everyone, but Patton especially. He saw the future of warfare. Tanks, mobility, speed. While others were still thinking in terms of trenches and attrition, Patton was imagining armored columns breaking through defensive lines. He studied, obsessively, read everything about tank warfare, trained relentlessly, built the American Tank Corps from almost nothing, and when he finally got to fight in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 1918, he led from the front, got shot, kept commanding from a shell hole until the morphine kicked in. The wound gave him time to think, to develop a philosophy of war that would define the rest of his career. War is won by speed, by aggression, by hitting the enemy before they're ready and not stopping until they break. Hesitation kills more men than bullets. Between the wars, he refined that philosophy, studied history. Patton was a serious student of military history in ways people don't always appreciate. He read Xenophon, Caesar, Napoleon, not for entertainment, for lessons, for patterns, for the underlying principles that transcend time and technology. He came to believe something fundamental, something that would shape every decision he made in World War II. War is won by will, not by material. The side that wants it more, that refuses to quit, that pushes through exhaustion and fear and impossible odds, that side wins. Logistics matter, supplies matter, numbers matter, but they're not what decides battles. What decides battles is the man willing to attack when everyone else says defend, the commander willing to advance when everyone else says consolidate. Patton believed this with religious intensity, and when World War II came, he got the chance to prove it. North Africa, Sicily, France. The pattern repeated. Patton attacked, fast, hard. Didn't wait for perfect preparation. Didn't wait for overwhelming force. Just attacked. And won. But Sicily taught him something else. Something darker. Something that would echo all the way to Linz in May 1945. Sicily, summer of 1943. Allied invasion to knock Italy out of the war. Two armies, British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery, American 7th Army under Patton. Montgomery got the main objective, the Glory Road north to Messina. Patton got the supporting role, protect Montgomery's flank. Except Patton didn't play support. He attacked, drove his 7th Army north with a speed that shocked everyone, including the Germans. Reached Messina before Montgomery, won the race, proved that American troops could move faster and hit harder than their British allies. But the cost was what stuck with him. Montgomery took weeks to prepare, carefully, methodically, built up supplies, coordinated with air support, made sure every detail was perfect before advancing. And when he finally moved, his casualties were low, his success was certain, but his speed was glacial. Patton moved immediately, improvised logistics, accepted risks, and his casualties were higher. Not catastrophically higher, but higher. Men died because Patton valued speed over caution. And here's what Patton learned from Sicily. Here's what he took away from that campaign and carried with him for the rest of the war. Both approaches worked, but only one approach won quickly. And in war, time is measured in lives. Every day Montgomery spent preparing was a day the Germans spent preparing too. Every day of careful logistics was a day the enemy reinforced positions, built defenses, moved reserves. The safe approach, when extended over time, cost more lives than the risky approach executed immediately. Patton came to believe that caution, pursued far enough, becomes its own kind of recklessness. This belief defined him through France, through the Bulge, through the drive into Germany. Attack, always attack. Don't give the enemy time to think. Don't give them time to prepare. Hit them when they're weak and keep hitting until they break. But there was something else. Something that developed in the last year of the war. Something about the Soviets. Patton started seeing Soviet officers in '44, at conferences, at coordination meetings. The alliance was supposed to be friendly, cooperative. But Patton watched the Soviet officers and saw something that bothered him. The way they talked about Poland, about Romania, about all the territory the Red Army was occupying in the East. They weren't talking about liberation. They were talking about security, about buffer zones, about ensuring that Germany could never threaten the Soviet Union again. Which sounded reasonable until you thought about what it meant for the people actually living in those buffer zones. Patton read intelligence reports that didn't make the newspapers, reports about what the NKVD was doing in Soviet-occupied territory, mass arrests, deportations, the installation of communist governments regardless of what the local populations wanted. And Patton started to believe something that official Allied policy didn't acknowledge. That the Soviet Union wasn't an ally, not really. That Stalin was using the war against Germany to expand Soviet control over Eastern Europe. That when Germany finally surrendered, the Western Allies would look up and realize they'd helped create a new threat to replace the old one. He talked about this, not loudly, not publicly, but in private, with officers he trusted. Patton would say things that made people uncomfortable. Things like, "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Better to do it now, while our armies are mobilized, than wait until they've consolidated control over half of Europe." The officers he told this to would nod, smile, change the subject, because you couldn't say things like that out loud. Not when official policy was Allied unity. Not when Roosevelt and Churchill were still talking about cooperation with Stalin in the post-war world. But Patton believed it the way he believed in speed and aggression and attacking before the enemy was ready. The Soviets were the enemy, maybe not today, maybe not officially, but soon. And when that day came, every mile of territory they controlled would be a mile the West would have to fight to get back. This is the man who crossed the Enns River on May 2nd, 1945. Not a reckless cowboy, not a glory-seeking general, a man who believed, deeply and completely, that the post-war world was being decided right now, right here, in these final weeks of the war against Germany, and that the decisions being made, or not made, would matter for decades.
Eisenhower knew all of this, knew Patton's beliefs, knew his brilliance and his flaws in equal measure. They'd known each other too long for illusions. Dwight David Eisenhower, born October 14, 1890, Texas, then Kansas, poor family, not California wealthy, not military aristocracy, just normal, middle America. The kind of background that teaches you to get along with people because you don't have the luxury of not getting along. He graduated West Point in 1915, same class as Omar Bradley. They were friends then, still friends now. Eisenhower didn't get to fight in World War I, spent it stateside, training tank crews, resented it at the time, thought his career was over before it started. But the peacetime army taught him something different than what Patton learned. Patton learned speed and aggression. Eisenhower learned politics and coalition building, how to get disparate groups to work together, how to manage egos, how to find compromise when everyone wants something different. This made him perfect for World War II, because World War II, at the strategic level, was about coalition warfare. Americans, British, French, Soviets, all with different objectives and different methods, and different ideas about what the post-war world should look like. Eisenhower's job was to hold that coalition together, not by force, by persuasion, by finding common ground, by being the man everyone could work with even when they couldn't work with each other. He was good at it, brilliant at it actually, but it came with a cost. The cost was men like Patton, brilliant battlefield commanders who saw the war in purely military terms and didn't much care about the political implications of their actions. Eisenhower needed Patton's tactical genius, but he also needed to control Patton's impulses when those impulses threatened the larger political strategy. And Linz was exactly that kind of threat. Eisenhower sat in his office in Reims and thought about the conversations he'd had over the past 6 months, with Churchill, with Roosevelt before he died, with Truman after, with Stalin through intermediaries. Everyone knew the alliance was fragile. Everyone knew Stalin had his own agenda in Eastern Europe. Everyone knew the Soviets were going to be difficult to deal with after Germany surrendered. But the official position, the political position, was that they'd handle those difficulties through negotiation, through the institutions they were building, the United Nations, the occupation zones, the agreements signed at Tehran and Yalta. Patton's position was different, simpler, more direct. The Soviets only respect force, so show them force, occupy territory and negotiate from strength, not from pieces of paper signed at conferences. And here's what kept Eisenhower up at night. Here's what he couldn't say out loud, but thought about constantly. Patton might be right. Intelligence reports from Poland were disturbing. Reports from Romania, from Bulgaria. The Soviets weren't liberating those countries, they were occupying them, installing communist governments, arresting anyone who disagreed. The NKVD was operating openly, and the stories that came back were the kind that made your stomach turn. Churchill saw it, sent private communications to Eisenhower expressing concern about Soviet intentions, talked about an iron curtain descending across Europe, urged caution about withdrawing too quickly from advanced positions. But Churchill couldn't say this publicly, because Britain needed the Soviet Union, needed Russian blood to keep German divisions tied up in the East, needed Stalin's cooperation for the post-war settlement. So Churchill worried privately and smiled publicly, and hoped everything would work out. Eisenhower understood the game, understood why they had to play it, but understanding didn't make it easier, because Patton was in Linz. American forces were 80 miles into the Soviet occupation zone, and Stalin was watching to see what the new American president would do. If Truman ordered a withdrawal, it would signal that the United States would abide by the Yalta agreements, that territorial boundaries mattered, that the alliance would continue, based on the framework established at the conferences. If Truman didn't order a withdrawal, or if Patton refused to obey the order, it would signal something else entirely, that the United States was preparing for confrontation, that the wartime alliance was over, that the lines being drawn across Europe were going to be contested. Either way, the decision mattered, more than who held Linz, more than Austrian occupation zones. This was about the post-war order, about whether the United States and the Soviet Union were going to be partners or rivals.
And it was all happening because George Patton crossed a river he was ordered not to cross and took a city he was ordered not to take. Eisenhower stood up from his desk, walked to the window, looked out at Reims. The war was almost over, days away, maybe hours. Germany was collapsing from every direction. The Third Reich was finished. But the peace was just beginning, and it was already more complicated than the war. He thought about Patton, about the phone call, about the click when Patton hung up. Eisenhower had protected Patton before, after the slapping incidents in Sicily, after the remarks about the Soviets that nearly caused an international incident. Protected him because Patton was too valuable to lose, too brilliant on the battlefield to sacrifice for political convenience. But Linz was different. This wasn't a slap soldier or an impolitic comment. This was unauthorized occupation of Allied territory. This was a potential crisis with Moscow. This was exactly the kind of thing Eisenhower couldn't ignore and couldn't fix with a quiet phone call. He was going to have to go to Austria, going to have to face Patton in person, going to have to make it clear, absolutely clear, that withdrawal wasn't optional. And then what? If Patton refused? If he stood in Linz and said no? Eisenhower didn't know, didn't want to think about it, because the answer would be relieving Patton of command, court-martial possibly, the end of one of the most brilliant military careers in American history. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was American and Soviet forces in an armed standoff. The alternative was the alliance fracturing before Germany even surrendered. The alternative was starting a new war before the old one was finished. Eisenhower turned from the window, made his decision. He would fly to Linz, soon. He would deliver the withdrawal order personally, face to face, commander to commander. The war was almost over. But the peace, the real challenge, was just beginning. And everything, absolutely everything, depended on what happened in Austria in the next 11 days. Chapter 3, The Crossing. May 2nd, 1945. 0400 hours. The Enns River, Austria. Darkness. Complete. The kind that comes just before dawn, when the world is at its quietest and coldest. The Enns moves south through Austria, black water reflecting nothing. On the west bank, American positions, Third Army forward elements, tanks, half-tracks, men in foxholes who've been fighting since Normandy and are so tired they don't remember what it feels like not to be tired. General Charles Kilburn stands on the west bank, 40 years old, commander of the 11th Armored Division, career officer, West Point, class of 27. He's good at his job, not brilliant like Patton, not political like Eisenhower, just competent, steady, the kind of division commander who executes orders and doesn't ask unnecessary questions. Except, right now he's asking questions, because the orders don't make sense. Patton arrived an hour ago, came up to the forward positions in a jeep with no headlights, driving roads that are supposedly secure, but might have German stragglers. Typical Patton. The man courts danger like other people court promotion. "Charlie," Patton said when he climbed out of the jeep. Always Charlie, never General Kilburn. Patton does this, uses first names, makes it personal, makes it harder to say no. They walked to a position overlooking the river. Patton studied the opposite bank through binoculars. Kilburn waited. You don't interrupt Patton when he's thinking. "The bridge is intact," Patton said finally. Kilburn looked. The bridge at Linz, 8 miles south, still standing. The Germans hadn't blown it. Either they forgot in the chaos of retreat, or they left it intact thinking they might need it later, or they just didn't care anymore. The Third Reich was dying. Bridges didn't matter much when your country was disappearing.
Yes, sir, Kilburn said. Intelligence confirms it. No demolition charges. No German forces in position to defend it. Patton lowered the binoculars, turned to Kilburn, and in the pre-dawn darkness, Kilburn saw something in Patton's face. Not excitement exactly. Purpose. The look of a man who's made a decision and is committed to it regardless of consequences. "We're crossing," Patton said. Kilburn blinked. "Sir, our orders are to hold at the ends. This is the stop line. Everything east of here is designated for Soviet occupation per the Yalta agreements." "I'm aware of our orders, Charlie. I'm also aware that the bridge is intact, the Germans are retreating, and somebody needs to secure Linz before it descends into chaos." Kilburn chose his words carefully. "The Soviets are supposed to secure Linz. That was agreed at Yalta. If we cross, we'll be in violation of—" "Yalta was an agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin," Patton interrupted. "Roosevelt is dead. Churchill is 5,000 miles away, and Stalin is too busy to care about one Austrian city. We're crossing, Charlie. Today. Now." Kilburn looked at the river, at the opposite bank, at the road that led east to Linz. 8 miles, maybe less, easy terrain, no German resistance reported. But this wasn't about terrain or resistance. This was about international agreements, about occupation zones, about the political framework for post-war Europe. "Sir," Kilburn said quietly, "this could create serious complications with our Soviet allies." Patton smiled. Not humor, something else. "Our Soviet allies are not our allies, Charlie. They're opportunists using this war to expand Soviet control over Eastern Europe. And the longer we wait, the more territory they control. We're crossing. Assemble the 11th Armored. I want lead elements across the ends by 0600. Kilburn opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "General Patton, I have to formally note that this action violates our current orders from SHAEF. I'm required to—" "Noted," Patton said. "Your objection is on the record. Now get your division moving." It wasn't a request. Kilburn saluted, walked back to his command post, started issuing orders. Because that's what you do in the army. You follow orders, even when those orders come from a general who's countermanding orders from an even higher general. By 0600 hours, the 11th Armored Division was crossing the Enns River. No fanfare, no artillery preparation, just tanks and half-tracks and trucks moving across an intact bridge in the grey light of early morning. The men didn't know why they were crossing, didn't know they were moving into Soviet-designated territory. They just knew Third Army was advancing again, which is what Third Army did. By 0800 hours, lead elements were in Linz. By noon, the entire 11th Armored Division was positioned in and around the city. By 1600 hours, the 65th Infantry Division was moving up in support. 80 miles in less than 12 hours. No shots fired, no resistance. The Germans were gone. The Soviets hadn't arrived yet, and George Patton was standing in a city that, according to the maps agreed upon at Yalta, shouldn't have American forces anywhere near it. Colonel Oskar Koch found Patton in what used to be the Linz City Hall. 48 years old, Third Army's intelligence officer, one of the best in the European theatre. The kind of officer who sees the bigger picture and doesn't like what he's seeing. "General," Koch said, "we need to talk about the Soviet reaction." Patton was studying a map. Local area around Linz, defensive positions, supply routes. He looked up. "What about it?" "Sir, Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army is 30 miles east. When they find out we're here, they're going to demand we withdraw. SHAEF is going to demand we withdraw. This is going to create a crisis at the highest levels." Patton nodded. "I know." "Then why?" "Because somebody needs to create a crisis, Oscar." Patton's voice was quiet, serious, the tone he used when he wasn't performing, when he was just speaking truth as he saw it. "Everybody in Washington and London is pretending the Soviets are our friends, that we're all going to cooperate in the post-war world, build the United Nations, have peace and prosperity. It's horseshit." Koch waited. "Stalin is taking everything we let him take," Patton continued. "Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, all of it. And when Germany surrenders, he's going to consolidate control and dare us to do something about it. But by then it'll be too late. Our armies will demobilize, the political will for confrontation will disappear, and Eastern Europe will be Soviet for a generation. So you're forcing the issue now, Koch said. I'm creating leverage, Patton corrected. We hold Linz. The Soviets want it. That gives Washington something to negotiate with. Maybe we get better terms on the occupation zones. Maybe we get concessions elsewhere. Maybe we just make Stalin think twice about how far he can push. Koch looked at the map, at Linz, at the Soviet positions 30 miles away. Sir, this only works if Washington backs you. If Eisenhower decides to use this as leverage instead of just ordering us to withdraw immediately. Eisenhower will do what's best, Patton said. He always does. And if what's best is ordering us out? Patton didn't answer immediately. He stared at the map, at American positions spreading through Linz, at his Third Army, once again where it wasn't supposed to be. Then we'll withdraw, Patton said finally. But we'll withdraw on our terms, after negotiations, after extracting concessions, not because Stalin screams and Washington jumps. Koch nodded slowly, understanding. This wasn't about holding Linz permanently. This was about changing the negotiating position before the final post-war settlement. It was also, Koch knew, completely unauthorized. Patton had just committed 23,000 American troops to positions 80 miles past their stop line without orders, without authorization, without even asking permission. If this worked, Patton would be vindicated. If it didn't, he'd be relieved of command. Get me a full defensive assessment, Patton said. I want to know every approach to this city, every road, every bridge. If the Soviets decide to push the issue, I want options. Koch saluted, left, started working on the assessment. Outside the city hall, American soldiers were establishing positions, setting up checkpoints, coordinating with Austrian civilians who were emerging from basements and shelters, cautious but curious. One of those civilians was Greta Lindemann, 42 years old, schoolteacher, lived in Linz her entire life. Survived the Nazi years by keeping her head down and not asking questions. Survived the final months of the war in a basement while artillery fell and the Reich collapsed. Now she stood on a street corner watching American soldiers direct traffic. Young men, tired, dirty, but not brutal, not like the Wehrmacht in its final desperate days, and not like what she'd heard about Soviet occupation. An American sergeant approached her. "Ma'am, do you speak English?" "Yes," Greta said, "a little. We're setting up civilian administration, schools need to reopen, food distribution needs to be organized. Can you help?" Greta stared at him, at this American sergeant asking for her help. Not demanding, not ordering, asking. "The Russians," she said quietly. "When are they coming?" The sergeant's expression didn't change. "I don't know, ma'am. Right now it's us. We're here to help get things running again." Greta looked down the street, at other American soldiers, at Austrian civilians starting to emerge, at a city that was, for the moment, neither German nor Soviet, just in between. "I can help," she said, "with the schools, with organization." The sergeant smiled. "Thank you, ma'am." This scene repeated across Linz, American civil affairs officers coordinating with Austrian officials, engineers restoring water service, medical units treating civilians, not occupation, administration, the kind of thing that creates legitimacy. By the end of May 2nd, Third Army wasn't just in Linz, it was running Linz. 180,000 Austrian civilians were, effectively, under American military government, which is exactly what Patton wanted. Because you can order soldiers to withdraw. It's harder to order soldiers to abandon a functioning civilian administration. 15 miles east of Linz, Ernst Adler sat in the darkness of a barracks at Mauthausen concentration camp. 67 years old, Austrian, Jewish. Arrested in 1938, 7 years in camps, Mauthausen for the last 2, survived by luck and willpower in proportions he couldn't calculate. The Germans abandoned Mauthausen on May 4th, just left. Guards disappeared overnight. Prisoners woke up to find themselves alone in a camp designed to kill them. No food, no water, no plan. Just 60,000 people too weak to walk, waiting to see what happened next. What happened next was Third Army. American soldiers arrived May 5th. Young men who stopped at the gates and stared. Ernst watched them, watched their faces change as they understood what they were seeing. Horror, disgust, rage. The Americans had liberated camps before, but Mauthausen was different. Mauthausen was one of the worst. The Americans brought food, medical supplies, organized evacuation for the weakest prisoners, set up field hospitals, did everything they could. But Ernst heard the rumors, heard prisoners whispering. The Americans weren't supposed to be here. This was supposed to be Soviet territory. The Americans might have to leave, might have to hand Mauthausen over to the Red Army. Ernst had survived 7 years of camps. He knew what different kinds of occupation looked like, knew the difference between liberators who cared and liberators who didn't. The Soviets, from what he'd heard, were complicated. They'd liberated camps in Poland, Auschwitz, Majdanek, freed prisoners. But then, they'd arrested anyone they suspected of being anti-Soviet, sent people from Nazi camps to Soviet camps. Different ideology, same methods. Ernst didn't want to go from one camp to another, didn't want to survive Hitler, only to disappear into Stalin's system. On May 6th, an American officer came through Mauthausen. Major. Ernst didn't catch the name. The major gathered a group of prisoners who could speak German, explained the situation. "You're free," the major said. "That's not changing. But there's a political complication. This area is supposed to be occupied by Soviet forces. We might have to transfer administration to them." Silence. The kind of silence that comes from people who've learned not to speak unless absolutely necessary. "When?" someone asked. "I don't know," the major said honestly. "We're hoping to negotiate, to keep this area under American administration, but I can't promise anything." Ernst raised his hand, an old habit from teaching before the camps. The major nodded at him. "What can we do?" Ernst asked. The major looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "To help you stay," Ernst said. "What can we do to help the Americans stay?" The major's expression softened. "Just rebuild. Show that you can recover. Show that American administration is working. That's all." After the major left, Ernst sat with other prisoners. Disgust. They'd survived by being passive, by not drawing attention, by making themselves invisible. But now, maybe, they needed to be visible, needed to show they wanted American protection, needed to make it harder for the Americans to leave. They didn't have much, but they had voices, had the ability to organize, had the moral weight of being survivors. Over the next 3 days, prisoners at Mauthausen did something unprecedented. They organized, formed committees, coordinated with American civil affairs, made it clear, loudly and publicly, that they preferred American administration to Soviet. It wasn't political. It was survival. These were people who'd learned to read power dynamics, who understood that choices made in distant capitals would determine whether they lived or died. They were making their preferences known in the only way they could. And Patton, when he heard about it, understood exactly what was happening. The prisoners were creating moral stakes, making withdrawal from Mauthausen not just a military decision, but a humanitarian one. Perfect. Chapter 4. The Soviet Perspective. May 5th, 1945. The Kremlin, Moscow. Joseph Stalin sat in his office, 66 years old, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Supreme Commander of Soviet forces, the man who'd led the Soviet Union through 4 years of the most brutal war in human history. He was reading a report from Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin, 53 years old, commander of the Third Ukrainian Front, responsible for Soviet operations in Austria. The report was succinct. American forces had crossed the Enns River, occupied Linz, established military government, were now positioned 80 miles into what the Yalta Conference had designated as the Soviet occupation zone. Stalin set down the report, looked at Vyacheslav Molotov, who stood by the window, 55 years old, foreign minister. the man who'd negotiated with the Western powers throughout the war. "Your assessment?" Stalin asked. Molotov chose his words carefully. "This is either a local commander exceeding his authority or a deliberate test by the new American president. Which do you think? Truman has been president for 3 weeks. He's inexperienced, under pressure to prove himself. This could be genuine confusion about the occupation zones, or it could be an intentional probe to see how we react." Stalin nodded slowly. He dealt with Roosevelt for 4 years, understood the man. Roosevelt was pragmatic, willing to negotiate, willing to compromise when necessary. But Roosevelt was dead. Harry Truman was an unknown quantity, a vice president elevated by death, no foreign policy experience, no relationship with Stalin. The Soviet premier had met Truman exactly once, briefly, at Roosevelt's funeral. And now, 3 weeks into his presidency, American forces were occupying Soviet-designated territory in Austria. "What does Tolbukin recommend?" Stalin asked. Molotov consulted another document. "He suggests moving the 6th Guards Tank Army to within striking distance of Linz, not to attack, just to demonstrate Soviet commitment to the Yalta boundaries. He believes the Americans will withdraw when they see our strength. And if they don't withdraw?" Silence. Because that was the question, wasn't it? If American forces refuse to leave, what then? Order Soviet forces to evict them. Risk armed confrontation between allies who just defeated Germany together. Stalin stood, walked to the map on his wall. Europe, color-coded, red for Soviet-controlled territory, blue for Western-controlled. The division was clear: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, all red, all Soviet. But Austria was supposed to be divided, occupation zones, Americans in the west, Soviets in the east. Vienna split between the 4 powers, all agreed at Yalta, except now the Americans were in Linz, in the Soviet zone, and Stalin had to decide how to respond. He thought about the war, about 27 million Soviet dead, about cities destroyed, about an economy in ruins. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the fighting against Germany. Soviet soldiers had done most of the dying. And now, with Germany finally defeated, Stalin intended to ensure that the Soviet Union's security was guaranteed. That meant buffer zones, meant controlling the territory between Soviet borders and potential future threats, meant making sure Germany could never invade again, meant essentially dominating Eastern Europe. The Western powers knew this. Roosevelt had known. Churchill knew. They didn't like it, but they'd accepted it as the price of Soviet cooperation in the war. But now, with Roosevelt dead and Truman untested, maybe the calculation was changing. "Send a formal protest," Stalin said, "through diplomatic channels. Make it clear that American forces in Linz violate the Yalta agreements. Demand immediate withdrawal to the Enns River line." Molotov nodded, made notes. "Also," Stalin continued, "order Tolbukin to move the 6th Guards Tank Army forward, within 20 miles of Linz. I want the Americans to understand we're serious. Should Tolbukin be authorized to use force if the Americans don't withdraw?" Stalin turned from the map, looked at Molotov. No force, not yet. This is political. We respond politically, but we also demonstrate strength. The Americans need to understand that Soviet occupation zones are not negotiable." Molotov left to draft the diplomatic protest. Stalin returned to his desk, sat, thought about the larger picture. The war was almost over, days away from German surrender. And then what? The real challenge would begin: rebuilding the Soviet Union while maintaining control over Eastern Europe, while managing relations with the Western powers. Stalin had no illusions about the post-war world. The alliance with America and Britain was temporary, expedient, based on the shared need to defeat Germany. Once Germany was gone, the natural tensions between communist and capitalist systems would resurface. The question was timing. When would the break come? How would it happen? And what would the final division of Europe look like? Linz was a test, a small test, one city in Austria. But tests matter. How the Americans responded would tell Stalin something about Truman, about American intentions, about whether the Western powers would abide by the Yalta agreements or challenge them. 300 miles south of Moscow, the Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army received new orders. Advance to within 20 miles of Linz, establish forward positions, demonstrate strength, but do not engage American forces without explicit authorization from Moscow. The 6th Guards was one of the elite formations of the Red Army, battle-hardened, experienced, 80,000 men, hundreds of tanks, the kind of force that could take Linz in a day if ordered. But they weren't being ordered to take Linz, just to position themselves, to create pressure, to show the Americans that Soviet forces were ready if this turned into a confrontation. Lieutenant Alexei Sokolov was part of that advance. 31 years old, tank commander, survivor of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the drive through Eastern Europe. He'd fought Germans for 3 years. Now he was advancing toward American positions, and nobody quite knew what that meant. His platoon moved west on May 6th, roads clogged with refugees, German prisoners, displaced persons, the debris of a collapsing empire. They passed through small Austrian towns where the population watched with expressions Sokolov recognized. Fear. The same fear he'd seen in Poland, in Romania, in Germany. People were afraid of the Red Army. Sokolov understood why. He'd seen what Soviet soldiers did in occupied territory. The looting, the casual violence, the settling of accounts for 4 years of brutal warfare. Officers tried to maintain discipline. Sometimes they succeeded. Often, they didn't. But Austria was supposed to be different. Austria was an ally, technically. The government in Moscow said so. Austria had been annexed by Germany, so Austrians were victims, not enemies. Sokolov didn't think the distinction mattered much to the men in his platoon. They'd been fighting since 1941, had lost friends, had seen their country devastated. They didn't differentiate between Germans and Austrians. It was all the enemy. On May 7th, Sokolov's platoon encountered American positions for the first time. A crossroads, 20 miles east of Linz, Sokolov's 3 tanks rounded a curve and found themselves facing 2 American M26 Pershings, heavy tanks, new design. Sokolov had seen intelligence reports on them, formidable. Both sides stopped, engines idling, gun barrels not quite aimed at each other, but not quite aimed away either. Sokolov climbed out of his tank, slowly, hands visible. An American officer did the same, captain, young, maybe 29. They met in the middle of the road. Neither spoke the other's language, but some things transcend language. 2 tank commanders, 2 armies, 1 road. The American pointed west, toward Linz, made a gesture that clearly meant, "That's ours." Sokolov pointed east, made the same gesture, "That's ours." They stood there, understanding. This was the line, unofficial, undrawn on any map, but real. American positions to the west, Soviet positions to the east. And this crossroads in between. The American offered a cigarette, American tobacco. Sokolov took it. They smoked in silence. 2 soldiers who'd spent years fighting the same enemy, now facing each other across a road in Austria, neither quite sure what happened next. After the cigarette, they returned to their tanks. The Americans didn't withdraw. The Soviets didn't advance. They just waited. Both sides reporting to their commanders, both sides asking for instructions. This scene repeated across the 20-mile zone between Linz and Soviet forward positions. American and Soviet patrols encountering each other. No shots fired, no aggression, just standoff. By May 8th, there were 3 documented encounters. 3 points where American and Soviet forces were in visual contact, neither withdrawing, both waiting for orders from higher command. The distance between the armies was shrinking. The chance of an accident, a misunderstanding, a single nervous soldier firing a shot that could cascade into something catastrophic was increasing. And in Moscow and Washington and London, diplomats and generals were trying desperately to prevent that shot from being fired. Chapter 5. Germany surrenders. May 7th, 1945.
02:41 hours. Reims, France. General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender on behalf of Germany. 55 years old, Chief of Operations Staff. One of the few senior Nazi officials not dead or captured. He sat at a table in a red schoolhouse that served as SHAEF headquarters and signed the document that ended the Third Reich. Eisenhower watched from another room. So did Marshal Georgy Zhukov, representing the Soviet Union, 48 years old, the man who'd defended Moscow, won Stalingrad, taken Berlin, the greatest Soviet general of the war. The signing took 17 minutes. Jodl's hand was steady, no drama, no speeches, just signatures on paper. The war in Europe was over. Eisenhower didn't attend the actual signing, wouldn't shake Jodl's hand, wouldn't grant the ceremony any more dignity than absolutely necessary. He stayed in another room, let his subordinates handle the formalities. But when it was done, when Jodl had signed and left, Eisenhower came out, looked at the document, at the signatures that ended 6 years of war, at the formal conclusion of the most destructive conflict in human history. Well, Eisenhower said quietly, that's that. Except it wasn't, because 23,000 American soldiers were in Linz, Austria, in Soviet-designated territory. And now that the war was officially over, the crisis was no longer tactical, it was purely political. During active combat you could justify things, fluid situations, rapidly changing front lines, the fog of war. But in peacetime? In peacetime, there's no excuse for being 80 miles past your designated boundary. Bedell Smith approached Eisenhower. Sir, we've received another communication from Marshal Tolbukin. He's demanding American withdrawal from Linz within 24 hours. Say that continuation of the occupation after Germany's surrender constitutes a violation of Allied agreements. Eisenhower rubbed his forehead. He'd been awake for 22 hours. The German surrender should have been a moment of relief, of celebration. Instead, he was dealing with Patton's unauthorized adventure in Austria. What's Patton's status? Eisenhower asked. Third Army has established military government in Linz. They're administering the city, coordinating with Austrian officials, running schools, organizing food distribution. General Patton has effectively created a functioning civil administration. Eisenhower understood the implication. Patton wasn't just occupying Linz, he was governing it, making it harder to withdraw, creating facts on the ground that would complicate any negotiated settlement. Brilliant, infuriating, completely unauthorized, pure Patton. Get me President Truman, Eisenhower said. The call took 20 minutes to connect. Secure lines, multiple relays, encryption. By the time Truman's voice came through, Eisenhower had prepared what he was going to say. Mr. President, this is General Eisenhower. I'm calling about the situation in Austria. Truman's voice was sharp, tired. The man had been president for 3 weeks and was already dealing with crises on multiple fronts. General, I've received formal protests from Ambassador Gromyko. Stalin himself sent a message asking if the United States intends to abide by the Yalta agreements. What the hell is happening in Linz? Eisenhower explained. Patton's unauthorized crossing, the occupation, the establishment of military government, the Soviet response, the current standoff. Silence on the line. Then, can you control your generals, Eisenhower? The question stung, because the honest answer was, usually. But Patton was special. Patton operated on his own logic, and sometimes that logic produced results, even when it violated orders. Yes, sir, Eisenhower said. I'm flying to Austria tomorrow. I'll deliver the withdrawal order personally. See that you do, Truman said. And General, this is my first major test with Stalin. I need it resolved, quickly, quietly, without making the United States look either weak or aggressive. Thread that needle. The line went dead. Eisenhower set down the phone. Thread that needle. Resolve the crisis. Control Patton. Maintain the alliance. Preserve American credibility. All while managing a general who just created the biggest diplomatic incident of the immediate post-war period. He called for Omar Bradley, 52 years old, commander of 12th Army Group, Patton's immediate superior.
Also Eisenhower's old friend from West Point. Bradley arrived within the hour. Quiet, steady, the opposite of Patton in temperament. Where Patton was flash and aggression, Bradley was careful calculation. "Brad," Eisenhower said, "I need your honest assessment. Can Patton be controlled?" Bradley sat down, thought about the question. George believes the Soviets are the next enemy, believes we're making a mistake negotiating with them instead of confronting them. He's not going to change his mind about that. I'm not asking him to change his mind. I'm asking him to follow orders. He will, Bradley said, eventually, but he'll push as far as he can first. That's who he is. Eisenhower nodded. He knew this, had known it for years. The question was whether pushing farther would create an irreparable breach with the Soviets. "I'm flying to Linz," Eisenhower said. "You're coming with me. We're going to make it absolutely clear that withdrawal is not optional." Bradley hesitated. "Ike, you should know. There are people at SHAEF who agree with George, not publicly, but privately. They think we're being too accommodating to Stalin, that we should use our position in Austria as leverage."
Do you agree with them?
"I think," Bradley said carefully, "that George sees something the rest of us are trying not to see. The Soviets aren't liberating Eastern Europe, they're occupying it. And when we look back in 10 years, we're going to wonder why we were so eager to hand them half the continent." Eisenhower stood, walked to the map, looked at the division of Europe that was crystallizing. Soviet zones, American zones, British zones. The boundaries that would define the post-war world. "Maybe you're right," Eisenhower said quietly. "Maybe George is right. But being right doesn't matter if acting on it destroys the alliance and starts a new war. We just ended one. I'm not starting another." "So we withdraw from Linz." "We negotiate," Eisenhower corrected. "We use Patton's occupation as leverage to get better terms. Then we withdraw. On our terms, not Stalin's." Bradley nodded slowly, understanding. This wasn't about Linz. This was about establishing precedent for how the United States and Soviet Union would interact in the post-war world. With strength, with negotiation, but ultimately with adherence to the framework established at Yalta. The war was over. The peace was beginning. And everything depended on what happened in Austria in the next week. May 8, 1945, evening, Reims. Eisenhower boards a C-47 transport aircraft. The decision is made. Tomorrow morning, he flies to Austria, faces Patton directly. Bradley walks him to the plane. The engines are already warming. The sound fills the airfield. Around them, SHAEF headquarters is celebrating. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. But Eisenhower isn't celebrating. "What will you say to him?" Bradley asks. Eisenhower stops at the base of the stairs, looks back at Bradley. The truth, that he's right about the Soviets, and that it doesn't matter. Bradley's expression doesn't change, but something flickers in his eyes. Understanding. Sadness, maybe. The recognition that sometimes being right isn't enough. "He won't accept that," Bradley says. "I know. He'll argue, he'll push back, he'll make the case that we're wasting an opportunity." "I know that too." Eisenhower climbs the stairs, pauses at the door of the aircraft, looks back at Reims, at SHAEF headquarters, at the place where Germany surrendered 6 hours ago. The war is over. The crisis is just beginning. And tomorrow, in Linz, 2 men will decide whether that crisis becomes catastrophe or opportunity. He enters the aircraft. The door closes. Through the window he can see the lights of Reims, the celebration he's not part of, the victory that feels incomplete. Bradley stands on the tarmac, watching the plane, thinking about Patton, about Eisenhower, about 2 friends caught between what's right and what's possible. The C-47's engines roar. The aircraft begins to taxi. And in a few hours, when dawn breaks over Austria, the real test will begin. Not the test of defeating Germany, that's done. The test of managing the peace, of controlling brilliant subordinates, of threading the needle between strength and diplomacy. The test that will define the next 45 years. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. May 9th, 1945, 0600 hours. RAF airfield outside Reims, France. Dawn breaks grey and cold. Eisenhower hasn't slept. Spent the night on the C-47 going through reports, planning what he'll say. Bradley is with him. So is Bedell Smith. 3 generals flying to Austria to confront a 4th. The flight takes 2 hours. Europe passes below. France, Germany. The landscape of war, cities bombed, bridges destroyed, the physical evidence of 6 years of destruction. And somewhere down there, in Austria, 23,000 American soldiers occupying a city they weren't authorized to take. Bradley sits across from Eisenhower, reading reports, pretending to anyway. After 30 years of friendship, Eisenhower can read Bradley's tells. The way he holds the paper, the frequency of page turns. Bradley's not reading, he's thinking. "What are you going to say to him?" Bradley asks finally. Eisenhower looks up. "I'm going to order him to withdraw." And when he asks why? "Because those are the orders." "That won't be enough," Bradley says quietly. "Not for George. He'll want to know why we're giving up Austrian territory to the Soviets, why we're honoring agreements with a regime that's brutalizing Poland and Romania, why we're being diplomatic when Stalin's being expansionist." Eisenhower knows this, has known it since the first report about Linz. Patton won't accept orders without understanding, won't execute withdrawal without arguing the strategic logic. "Then I'll tell him the truth," Eisenhower says, "that he's right about the Soviets, that Churchill agrees, that half the intelligence community agrees. But that understanding a problem and acting on it are different things. We have agreements. We have an alliance. We have a president who needs to establish credibility with Stalin to manage the peace. And we have Patton in Linz, creating an international incident that threatens all of it." Bradley nods. He'll say he created an opportunity, not an incident. "I know." He'll say we're wasting the opportunity. "I know that too." Silence. The C-47's engines drone. Below, the Austrian Alps come into view. Mountains still capped with snow even in May. Beautiful country. Fought over. Bled over. Now divided between powers that are already starting to distrust each other. "Ike," Bradley says, "what if he refuses?" Eisenhower has thought about this. Thought about it constantly since the first phone call. What happens if Patton simply says no? If he stands in Linz and refuses to withdraw? "Then I relieve him of command," Eisenhower says. "Court-martial if necessary. I don't want to. God knows I don't want to. But I can't have generals ignoring orders. Can't have the military conducting its own foreign policy." Bradley looks out the window. That would be the end of his career. Yes, he's the best battlefield commander we have. I know. History might prove him right about the Soviets. History might, Eisenhower agrees, but I have to make decisions based on the present, not hypothetical futures. And in the present, American forces are in Soviet-designated territory without authorization, and I need them out. The C-47 begins its descent. Through the window, Eisenhower can see Linz, the Danube River cutting through the city, American vehicles on the streets. His Third Army, 80 miles from where it should be. They land at a forward airstrip on the outskirts of Linz. 0800 hours. Patton is waiting. Full uniform, 2 ivory-handled revolvers, ramrod straight. He salutes as Eisenhower steps off the plane. "Welcome to Linz, sir." Eisenhower returns the salute, studies Patton's face, looking for, what? Defiance? Apology? Some sign of what's coming? He sees neither. Patton's expression is neutral, professional. The mask he wears when he's prepared for confrontation. "We need to talk, George. Now." They walk to a command tent, maps on the table, reports stacked in corners. This is Patton's forward headquarters, the place he's been running his unauthorized occupation from. Eisenhower doesn't sit, neither does Patton. Bradley and Smith wait outside, giving them privacy for what's coming. The tent is quiet. Outside, the sounds of Third Army operations, vehicles, radio chatter, the mundane machinery of occupation. Inside, 2 men who've known each other for 3 decades, about to have the most important conversation of their relationship. "George," Eisenhower says, and his voice is hard, controlled. "I'm ordering you to withdraw to the Enns River. This comes from President Truman himself. Patton's jaw tightens, just slightly. Ike, we both know what happens if we pull out. The Soviets move in. The same Austrians who greeted us as liberators get Soviet occupation. The survivors at Mauthausen get Soviet administrators. Is that what we won this war for? We won this war as allies, Eisenhower says. That includes the Soviets. We won this war, Patton's voice rises, passion breaking through the professional mask. And now we're handing half of Europe to Stalin on a silver platter. You know what he's doing in Poland. In Romania, you've read the intelligence reports. We're giving him Austria too. We just ended one war. You want to start another. I want to win the peace, not just the war. The words hang in the air. Win the peace. As if peace is something that can be won through military occupation rather than negotiation. Eisenhower walks to the map on the table, stares at it, at Linz, at the Enns River, at the line that marks the agreed boundary between American and Soviet zones. And then he says something that changes the conversation. You're right. Patton blinks. What? About all of it, Eisenhower continues, still looking at the map. Stalin is taking everything we let him take. The Austrian people would rather have us than the Red Army. And strategically, Linz matters. You're right, George. Patton waits, because there's obviously a but coming. So we stay? Patton asks carefully. No. Eisenhower turns to face him. We withdraw to the Enns, in 1 week, and during that week, we negotiate with the Soviets for a different occupation line. Negotiate with what leverage? With the leverage that we're currently occupying Linz, Eisenhower says. That's your leverage, George. You created it. Now I'm going to use it. Understanding dawns on Patton's face. This isn't capitulation. This is strategy. Use the occupation as a bargaining chip. Extract concessions. Then withdraw on terms favorable to the United States, not as a panicked response to Soviet protests. 1 week, Patton says slowly. 1 week. I'll delay the withdrawal order for 1 week. That gives our diplomats time to negotiate with Moscow. If we can adjust the occupation line, we adjust it. If we can get better terms on Mauthausen, we get them. If we can't, we withdraw. But we do it on our terms, not Stalin's. And if the Soviets refuse to negotiate, then we withdraw, Eisenhower says firmly, because the alternative is an armed confrontation with the Red Army in peacetime Austria. And that, George, is not an option. Patton walks to the map, stares at it, at the city he seized without orders, at the ground his army holds. The silence stretches. Outside, an American jeep drives past, voices calling orders, the normal sounds of military operations. Finally, Patton speaks. 1 week. 1 week, Eisenhower confirms. Patton turns back to Eisenhower. His face is hard, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge that cuts. Ike, I hope someone understands that we're on the eve of giving away the fruits of our victory to a potentially more dangerous enemy than the one we just defeated. The words land like artillery, because Patton isn't talking about tactics anymore. He's talking about the fundamental nature of the post-war world, about whether the Soviet Union is an ally or an adversary, about whether the peace will be cooperative or confrontational. And he's articulating what would become the Cold War in May 1945, before anyone in Washington or London was ready to hear it. Eisenhower doesn't respond immediately. He looks at Patton, at the general who just put into words what Churchill is saying privately, and what half the intelligence community is thinking but can't say publicly. I understand, George, Eisenhower says quietly. I understand exactly what you're saying. Do you? Yes, and so does Churchill, and so does half the intelligence community. But understanding isn't the same as acting. We have agreements, we have alliances, we have a president who needs to build credibility with Stalin to manage the peace. And we have you in Linz without authorization, creating an international incident. I created an opportunity. You created a crisis, Eisenhower counters. But you also gave us leverage, so I'm using it. 1 week. Withdrawal to the Enns on May 15th. That's final. Patton salutes. Understood, sir. Eisenhower returns the salute. Then he does something unexpected, something that reveals the complexity of this moment, of this relationship, of the impossible position both men are in. He extends his hand. Patton takes it. They shake, not as commander and subordinate, as equals, as two men who see the world differently, but respect each other's perspective. "You were right about the Soviets, George," Eisenhower says. "Just so you know, you were right. But not right enough to act on it."
"Not yet," Eisenhower says. And there's weight in those two words. Not yet. Implying that maybe, someday, Patton's view will become official policy. But not today. They release the handshake. Eisenhower turns and walks out of the tent. Bradley and Smith are waiting. The three generals walk back to the C-47, board, take off. Patton stands alone in the tent, looking at the map, at Linz, at the line he crossed without orders. He knows what's coming. 1 week of negotiations, then withdrawal. His Third Army pulling back to the Enns River and Soviet forces moving into Linz. But for 1 week, he has leverage. For 1 week, Washington has something to negotiate with. For 1 week, the Austrian people under American administration will demonstrate the difference between Western and Soviet occupation. It's not what Patton wanted, but it's more than he had any right to expect. Outside the tent, Colonel Oscar Koch approaches. "Sir, Eisenhower's plane just took off."
"What are your orders?"
Patton doesn't turn from the map. "Maintain all defensive positions, no withdrawals without my direct order, and coordinate with civil affairs. I want Linz running smoothly, schools open, food distributed, infrastructure repaired. I want this city to be a model of American administration." Koch nods, understands. They have 1 week to demonstrate that American occupation works. 1 week to create facts on the ground that make withdrawal politically costly. "And Colonel," Patton adds, "no incidents with Soviet forces. If their patrols approach, be polite, professional, but don't move. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Koch leaves. Patton remains, staring at the map. He's not naive. He knows 1 week won't change the fundamental trajectory of post-war Europe. Stalin will get his buffer zones. Eastern Europe will fall under Soviet domination. The Iron Curtain that Churchill warned about will descend. But maybe, just maybe, 1 week in Linz will establish a precedent, will show that the United States is willing to negotiate from strength. Will demonstrate that occupation zones are not sacred. Will plant the seed of an idea that will grow into containment policy and the Truman Doctrine and NATO. Or maybe not. Maybe Linz is just one city, 1 week, one unauthorized occupation that ends in withdrawal and changes nothing. Patton doesn't know, can't know. The future is opaque, but he knows this. He did what he thought was right, seized an opportunity, forced the issue, made the post-war settlement in Austria a negotiation instead of a foregone conclusion. Whether history vindicates him or condemns him, he can live with that.
Chapter 7.
The Negotiation. May 10th through May 12th, 1945. Moscow and Washington. The diplomatic marathon begins. W. Averell Harriman, American ambassador to the Soviet Union, 53 years old, wealthy, connected, one of the architects of the American relationship with Stalin throughout the war. He sits in the Kremlin across from Vyacheslav Molotov and begins the most delicate negotiation of his career. The United States, Harriman says carefully, is prepared to withdraw forces from Linz in accordance with the Yalta agreements. However, we believe certain adjustments to the occupation zone boundaries would be mutually beneficial. Molotov's expression doesn't change. The boundaries were agreed at Yalta by President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and General Secretary Stalin. They are not subject to revision. Perhaps not revision, Harriman counters, but clarification. The situation at Mauthausen concentration camp, for example, presents unique humanitarian considerations. This is the angle Eisenhower and the State Department developed. Don't argue about territory, argue about humanitarian necessity. Make it about the prisoners, not the power politics. Molotov considers. What are you proposing?
Temporary American administration of Mauthausen and the immediate surrounding area. 6 months. Time for the prisoners to recover, to be repatriated if they choose. After 6 months, full transfer to Soviet administration per the Yalta boundaries. Temporary American administration of Soviet-designated territory. Molotov repeats. And what prevents this temporary arrangement from becoming permanent? Harriman pulls out a document, pre-prepared, detailed timeline, specific benchmarks, written guarantees. This protocol ensures withdrawal, 6 months maximum, full transparency, Soviet observers welcome. The negotiation continues for 3 days. 72 hours of back and forth, Harriman proposing, Molotov countering, both men reporting to their respective capitals, both receiving instructions, both trying to find the narrow path between their nation's interests. In Washington, Truman follows the negotiations closely, very closely. This is his first major diplomatic test, his first real interaction with Stalin as president. Everything he does will set precedent for how the Soviet Union views American resolve. What's Harriman's assessment? Truman asks his Secretary of State. He thinks Molotov will accept a modified boundary, not a major change, but enough to keep Mauthausen under American administration temporarily. The Soviets want us out of Linz more than they want to fight over one concentration camp. And Stalin, what's his calculation? Stalin wants to avoid confrontation. He's gotten everything he wants in Poland and Romania. Austria is secondary. If he can get us out of Linz with minimal concessions, that's a win for him. Truman nods. Tell Harriman he's authorized to accept temporary administration of Mauthausen. 6 months, no more. And make sure the withdrawal from Linz happens on schedule. I want this resolved by May 15th. The message goes to Moscow. Harriman presents the revised proposal. Molotov takes it to Stalin. In the Kremlin, Stalin reads the American proposal. 6 months of temporary administration over Mauthausen and a small zone around it. Full withdrawal from Linz and the rest of the Soviet zone. American guarantees of complete transfer after the 6-month period. Your recommendation? Stalin asks Molotov. Accept it, Molotov says. We get the Americans out of Linz, which is what we wanted. Mauthausen is a concentration camp full of half-dead prisoners, not strategically valuable. 6 months of American administration costs us nothing and avoids confrontation. Stalin thinks about this, thinks about the larger picture. The Americans are testing him, seeing if he'll enforce the Yalta boundaries. But they're also showing flexibility, willing to negotiate, willing to make concessions. If he refuses this proposal, if he demands full, immediate withdrawal with no adjustments, it might provoke exactly the kind of confrontation he wants to avoid. The Americans might dig in. Patton might refuse to leave. The situation could escalate. Better to take the win, get the Americans out of Linz, accept a small, temporary concession on Mauthausen. Establish the precedent that Yalta boundaries are negotiable, but only slightly, only with Soviet permission. Accept the proposal, Stalin says, but make it clear that this is a one-time accommodation. Any future violations of occupation zone boundaries will not be tolerated. The agreement is drafted. May 12, 1945. The United States will withdraw all forces from Linz by May 15th. The Soviet Union will permit temporary American administration of Mauthausen and a 15-mile radius around it for 6 months, after which full transfer will occur. Both sides sign. Both sides declare victory. Both sides understand that what actually happened was a compromise neither fully wanted but both could accept. The news reaches Linz on May 13th. Patton reads the agreement in his headquarters, sees the terms. Withdrawal by May 15th. Temporary administration of Mauthausen for 6 months. He's getting 60% of what he wanted. Not bad for an unauthorized occupation. But the larger question remains, did this matter? Did 1 week in Linz change anything? Patton doesn't know. Won't know for years, maybe decades. But he knows this. The United States negotiated from strength, used military position as diplomatic leverage, got concessions from the Soviet Union, established precedent that occupation zones, while important, are not sacred. In the larger sweep of the Cold War, Linz will be a footnote, a small crisis, a minor adjustment to boundaries that mattered for 6 months and then reverted. But precedents matter, and the precedent established in Austria in May 1945 is that the United States will negotiate with the Soviet Union from positions of strength, not just diplomatic niceties. Whether that precedent matters, history will judge. May 15th, 1945, Linz, Austria. Third Army withdraws, not to the original Enns River line, to the modified boundary negotiated in Moscow, 15 miles east of the Enns, encompassing Mauthausen. The withdrawal is orderly, professional. Patton ensures it. No chaos, no last-minute resistance, just American forces executing orders with the discipline expected of the United States Army. Greta Lindemann watches the Americans leave, stands on a Linz street corner as tanks and trucks roll west. The Americans who'd administered her city for 11 days, who'd opened the schools, organized food distribution, treated Austrians like people instead of subjects. Now they're leaving, and Soviet forces are moving in. She doesn't know what comes next. Soviet occupation could be benign, could be harsh. She's heard rumors, stories from refugees, but rumors are just rumors. An American soldier passes, young, tired. He nods at her. She nods back. Small gesture. Human connection in the machinery of occupation. Then the Americans are gone, and Soviet tanks appear on the eastern horizon. Greta goes home, locks her door, waits to see what Soviet occupation will bring. At Mauthausen, Ernst Adler has a different experience. The Americans aren't leaving. Not yet. 6 more months of American administration, 6 months to recover, to decide what comes next, to live without fear of immediate Soviet control. He stands at the camp gates, free, truly free for the first time in 7 years, and, for the next 6 months at least, he's free under American protection. It's not permanent. In 6 months the Soviets take over, but 6 months is enough time to leave if he chooses, to relocate, to start over somewhere that isn't behind what Churchill is starting to call the Iron Curtain. An American officer approaches, same major from before. "Mr. Adler, we're establishing a repatriation center, helping survivors get to wherever they want to go. Do you know where you want to go?" Ernst thinks about this. Where does a 67-year-old Austrian Jew who's lost everything go? "America," Ernst says, "if they'll have me." The major smiles. "I think we can arrange that." Chapter 8. The Prophet. December 9th, 1945. Mannheim, Germany. George Patton sits in his headquarters, writing in his diary. The war's been over for 7 months. His Third Army is occupying Bavaria, governing, administering, doing the mundane work of post-war reconstruction. He's frustrated. The army is demobilizing, millions of soldiers going home, the force that conquered Germany being dismantled, while the Soviet Union keeps its massive armies in Eastern Europe. Patton sees the asymmetry, sees the danger, writes about it constantly. His diary entry for December 9th reads simply, "We defeated the wrong enemy." 5 words, but they contain Patton's entire worldview. His belief that the real threat was never Germany alone, but the Soviet Union. That the United States spent 4 years helping Stalin conquer Eastern Europe. That the victory over Hitler was real, but incomplete, because it left Stalin stronger than ever. He said this before. We'll say it again. It makes people uncomfortable, makes politicians angry, makes Eisenhower's job harder. But Patton believes it with the same certainty he believed in speed and aggression and attacking before the enemy was ready. 3 days later, December 12th, Patton is riding in a staff car near Mannheim. Routine trip, normal day. The car collides with a truck. Not dramatic, not high speed. Just one of those accidents that happen on occupied roads with military traffic. Patton is thrown forward. His head hits a metal partition. Neck injury, severe, paralyzing. He's taken to a hospital. American doctors do everything they can, but the injury is catastrophic. Patton is paralyzed from the neck down. For 9 days he lies in a hospital bed, conscious, alert, unable to move. Eisenhower visits, so does Bradley, old friends, old comrades. They sit with Patton, talk about the war. Carefully avoid talking about the future Patton won't have. On December 21st, 1945, George Smith Patton Jr. dies. 60 years old, 4-star general, one of the greatest battlefield commanders in American history. The official cause is pulmonary embolism, complication from the paralysis. The unofficial whispers, which will persist for decades, suggest something else. Assassination, Soviet agents, revenge for Linz, or for Patton's constant anti-Soviet rhetoric. No evidence supports this. The accident was investigated, found to be exactly that, an accident. But the whispers persist, because Patton was the kind of man who made enemies, who said things that threatened powerful interests, who died in a way that was convenient for people who wanted him silent. History will never know for certain. The truth died with Patton.
Eisenhower reads the news in his office, sits for a long moment, thinking about Patton, about Sicily and France and Germany and Austria, about brilliance and flaws and the complicated legacy of a complicated man. He writes a personal letter to Patton's widow, private, not for publication. In it he writes something he could never say publicly. George saw clearly what many of us were trying not to see. He understood the Soviet threat when official policy was still cooperation. His instincts about the post-war world were more accurate than our diplomacy. History, I believe, will prove him right, even if his timing was impossible. The letter is sealed, sent, never published in Eisenhower's lifetime. But decades later, when the papers are released, historians read it, understand it, recognize that Eisenhower, even in December 1945, knew Patton was right about the Soviets, just not right in a way that could be acted upon. Not yet. 1947, March 12th, Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman addresses a joint session of Congress, announces what will become known as the Truman Doctrine. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Containment, the official American policy toward the Soviet Union. Not cooperation, not alliance. Containment, limiting Soviet expansion, defending free nations, drawing lines across Europe that Stalin cannot cross without confrontation. Everything Patton argued for in May 1945, now official policy. 1948. The Marshall Plan. $16 billion to rebuild Western Europe, creating an economic buffer against Soviet expansion. Exactly what Patton said was necessary. 1949. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, military alliance to counter the Soviet threat. The formalization of the division Patton foresaw. 1948. Linz, Austria, under Soviet occupation. Greta Lindemann teaches again. The school reopened. Soviet administrators allowed it. They need teachers. But it's different. The curriculum is controlled. Certain topics cannot be discussed. Students learn Russian now, not English. She thinks about those 11 days in May 45, when Americans ran the city, when she felt, briefly, like the future might be different. It wasn't. The Soviets came, stayed, will stay for years. But she remembers, and when students ask about the war, about the occupation, she tells them, there was a moment when it could have been different. It lasted 11 days. They don't understand. Not yet. But someday, maybe they will. November 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. Ernst Adler stands on a dock. He's gained 20 pounds. American food, American medical care, 6 months to recover what 7 years took away. The ship is called the SS Marine Flasher, destination New York. He carries one suitcase, everything he owns, but he's alive, free, going to a country that gave him 6 months when it didn't have to. An American officer helped with the paperwork. Good luck, Mr. Adler. Welcome to America. Ernst climbs the gangway, looks back at Europe, at Austria, at everything he's leaving, then turns toward the ship, toward America, toward the future Patton's 11 days helped make possible. He doesn't know if 11 days mattered in the grand scheme, doesn't know if Patton's gambit changed anything, but he knows this. He's alive, he's free, he's going to America.
And that, for him, is everything. 1962. United Nations, New York. Two men shake hands at a diplomatic reception. One American, one Soviet, both veterans. Captain Randall Whitmore, retired, now works for State Department, 51 years old. And across from him, Soviet Colonel Alexei Sokolov, military attaché, 48 years old. They recognize each other instantly, haven't seen each other since that crossroads in Austria, May 1945, when they stood between their tanks and smoked a cigarette and didn't know what came next. "You remember," Sokolov says in halting English. "I remember," Whitmore confirms. They don't talk about politics, don't argue about the Cold War, just two soldiers who faced each other once and chose not to fire. "We were lucky," Sokolov says finally. "Yes," Whitmore agrees, "we were." They shake hands again, return to their respective delegations. The Cold War continues. But for one moment, two men who could have started it chose not to. And that choice, made on a crossroads in Austria 17 years ago, still matters. 1955. Austria declares neutrality. One of the only countries in Eastern Europe not under Soviet domination. Partly because of the precedent set in May 1945. The precedent that occupation zones could be negotiated, that American presence mattered, that Linz, for 11 days, demonstrated an alternative to Soviet control. 1963. Eisenhower is writing his memoirs, presidential memoirs, reflecting on the war, on the decisions made, on the peace that followed. He writes about Patton and Austria, carefully, diplomatically, but honestly. General Patton's instincts about the Soviet Union were correct, even if his timing was impossible. He wanted to hold the line in Austria. Within 2 years we were drawing lines all across Europe, trying to contain exactly what he predicted. His unauthorized occupation of Linz created complications at the time, but it also established precedent for negotiation from strength that served American interests in the early Cold War. Vindication, partial, posthumous, but vindication nonetheless. The statistics tell the story of Linz. Numbers that seem small but ripple outward. 80 miles. The distance Patton advanced beyond his authorized position. 23,000. American troops occupying Soviet-designated territory. 80,000. Soviet troops that could have evicted them by force, but didn't. 11 days. The duration of the standoff. 0. Casualties from the confrontation. Despite multiple near misses and tremendous tension, not a single shot fired between American and Soviet forces. 6 months. The negotiated period of American administration over Mauthausen. Thousands. The number of concentration camp survivors who used those 6 months to escape Soviet-controlled territory and start new lives. 45 years. The duration of the Cold War that Patton predicted in May 1945. These numbers matter. Not because Linz changed the Cold War, it didn't. The forces that created the East-West confrontation were larger than one Austrian city. But Linz established something, a template, a precedent, a demonstration that the United States would negotiate with the Soviet Union from positions of strength, not just diplomatic agreements. When Truman announced the doctrine of containment in 1947, he was implementing, officially and globally, what Patton had done locally and temporarily in Austria, drawing a line, saying, "This far and no further." The Truman Doctrine worked because it had credibility, because the Soviet Union believed the United States would back up its commitments with force if necessary. And that credibility came, in part, from Linz, from the demonstration that American forces would occupy territory, even unauthorized territory, if strategic interests required it, and then withdraw, but only after negotiation, only with concessions, only on terms that preserved American interests. Patton created that precedent, whether he meant to or not. Epilogue. 1991. August. Moscow. The Soviet Union is collapsing. The coup has failed. The red flag is coming down from the Kremlin. In a small apartment in Vienna, an old woman watches on television. Greta Lindemann, 88 years old. Lived through Nazi occupation, Soviet occupation, Austrian neutrality. Now she's watching the empire that occupied her city finally fall. She thinks about May 1945, about 11 days when American soldiers administered Linz, about the choice that was made, about the withdrawal that seemed like defeat. And she realizes Patton was right, Eisenhower was right, both were right. Patton saw the threat, Eisenhower managed it. Together, they created a framework that contained Soviet expansion for 46 years. Not perfectly, not without cost, but contained, until the empire collapsed under its own weight. The television shows crowds in Red Square, people celebrating, the hammer and sickle coming down.
Greta turns off the television, sits in silence. 46 years. From Linz to this moment, from Patton's unauthorized occupation to the Soviet Union's dissolution. She remembers the American sergeant who asked for her help, the young soldier who nodded at her on May 15th, the 11 days when things could have been different. Maybe they were different. Maybe 11 days did matter. She goes to bed, dreams of American soldiers directing traffic in an Austrian city, of a future that could have been. That, in its own way, was. The empire is dead, the prophecy fulfilled. It just took half a century to prove Patton right. The graves at Luxembourg, where Patton is buried, among his men, among the soldiers who followed him from North Africa, through Sicily, through France, through Germany. Eisenhower visited once, after Patton's death, stood at the grave, said nothing, just stood there, thinking about everything they'd been through together. Years later, someone asked Eisenhower about Patton, about Linz, about whether Patton was right. George was always right about the enemy, Eisenhower said. He just had trouble distinguishing between the enemy we were fighting and the enemy we would fight next. In May 1945, that distinction mattered. Years later, it mattered less. George was ahead of his time, which, in war and politics, can be just as dangerous as being behind. The questioner pressed, but did Linz matter? Did those 11 days change anything? Eisenhower thought about this, thought about the negotiations, about Mauthausen, about the precedent established, about the template for containment that emerged from one unauthorized occupation in Austria. It mattered, Eisenhower said finally. Maybe not in the way George intended, maybe not as much as he hoped, but it mattered. We learned something in Linz. We learned that negotiating with the Soviets required leverage, required strength, required being willing to occupy ground and make them negotiate for it. That lesson served us well in the Cold War. So Patton was right? Patton was right about what, wrong about when. And in strategy, timing is everything. The moral questions remain. Unanswered. Perhaps unanswerable. Was Patton right to disobey orders? To occupy Linz without authorization? To create an international crisis in the final days of the war? From one perspective, absolutely not. Military discipline requires obedience. The chain of command exists for reasons. Generals cannot conduct independent foreign policy. From another perspective, maybe. Patton saw something real, the Soviet threat, the impending division of Europe. He acted on that insight, created leverage, forced negotiation, saved lives at Mauthausen. Both things can be true. Patton can be right about the strategic picture and wrong about the tactical execution, can be prophetic about the Cold War and irresponsible about how he forced the issue. History doesn't resolve these contradictions. It just records them. What we know for certain is this. In May 1945, George Patton occupied a city he wasn't authorized to take. Dwight Eisenhower flew to Austria and ordered withdrawal. They negotiated, compromised. The United States withdrew from Linz, but kept Mauthausen for 6 months. And in that negotiation, in that compromise, a template was established for how the United States would engage with the Soviet Union for the next 45 years. Not through blind cooperation, not through immediate confrontation, through negotiation from strength, through drawing lines and defending them, through containment. Patton didn't create the Cold War.
Stalin did that. But Patton articulated the American response before anyone else, demonstrated it, proved it could work. For that, history remembers him, not as a perfect general, not as a flawless strategist, but as a prophet who saw the future and tried to change it. The attempt mattered, the 11 days mattered, the precedent mattered. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, 46 years after Patton's prediction, the world proved him right. It just took half a century.